Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The palace walls loomed tall and imposing, their cold stone surfaces reflecting the equally frigid atmosphere that filled the halls of the kingdom of Elandria. Prince Eric, the only son of King Alaric, stood at the window of his chamber, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the sprawling gardens below, but the beauty of the scene did little to lift his spirits. The weight of his responsibilities pressed down on him like an anchor, pulling him deeper into a pit of despair he couldn't escape. From the time he was a child, Eric had been groomed for the throne. Tutors and advisors had filled his days with lessons on governance, diplomacy, and the art of war. His father had drilled into him the importance of duty and the necessity of sacrifice, but Eric had always felt a gnawing emptiness within him. The endless political machinations of the court, the constant scheming and backstabbing, had eroded his sense of purpose. He longed for a life free from the burdens of royalty, a life where he could simply be Eric, not the crown prince of Elandria. That night, as the palace slept, Eric wandered through the shadowy corridors, his mind restless and troubled. The echo of his footsteps was the only sound that broke the silence, and he welcomed it, for it drowned out the tumultuous thoughts that plagued him. His path took him to the library, a vast chamber filled with ancient tomes and scrolls, many of which had not been touched in decades. The library had always been a place of refuge for Eric, a sanctuary where he could lose himself in stories of faraway lands and forgotten heroes. As he wandered through the dusty aisles, his attention was drawn to a quiet corner of the room where two elderly courtiers sat, deep in conversation. Eric paused, his curiosity piqued, and quietly moved closer to listen. The men were speaking in hushed tones, their words barely audible. "The forgotten land," one of the men said, his voice tinged with reverence. "A place where all your pain and sorrow can be left behind, where you can find peace." Eric's heart skipped a beat. He had heard whispers of this mythical place before, but never with such conviction. The other man nodded in agreement. "They say those who enter never return," he replied. "But who would want to leave? To forget all your troubles, to live in eternal peace? It's a tempting thought." Eric's mind raced as he considered the possibility. Could such a place truly exist? A land where he could escape the burdens of his life, where he could finally find the peace he so desperately craved? The thought took hold of him, and he felt a surge of hope, something he had not felt in a long time. He left the library that night with a newfound resolve. He would find this forgotten land, and he would leave behind the life that had caused him so much pain. He would find solace in a place where his responsibilities could no longer reach him. The following night, Eric set out from the palace under the cover of darkness. He wore simple clothes, nothing that would mark him as a prince, and carried only a small pack with food and water. His heart pounded with a mixture of fear and excitement as he slipped through the gates and into the night. The city of Elandria was quiet, its streets deserted, and Eric moved quickly, eager to leave the familiarity of the city behind. His journey took him through the kingdom's countryside, a vast expanse of forests, mountains, and rivers. Eric traveled for days, his path guided only by the vague directions he had overheard in the library. He encountered few people along the way, and those he did meet were simple folk, farmers and travelers who had no knowledge of the forgotten land. Still, Eric pressed on, driven by the hope that he was getting closer to his destination. As the days turned into weeks, Eric's journey grew more difficult. The forests became denser, the mountains steeper, and the rivers more treacherous. The physical exertion took a toll on him, but it also provided a distraction from the thoughts that still haunted him. Each step he took brought him further from the life he had known, and closer to the peace he sought. One day, after crossing a particularly perilous mountain pass, Eric found himself standing before an ancient archway, half covered in moss and vines. The stones were worn with age, and strange symbols were etched into their surface, symbols that Eric could not decipher. But there was no mistaking it, this was the gateway to the Forgotten Land. His heart swelled with anticipation as he stepped through the archway, leaving behind the world he had known. The moment Eric crossed the threshold, he was enveloped by a profound sense of calm. The air was warm and fragrant, filled with the scent of blooming flowers. The landscape before him was breathtaking, rolling hills covered in lush green grass, crystal-clear lakes that sparkled in the sunlight, and a sky that was a perpetual shade of gold. It was as if he had stepped into a dream, a place untouched by the troubles of the world. Eric walked through the land, marveling at its beauty. He saw no signs of the people who supposedly lived there, but he felt no fear. The peace that surrounded him was so complete that it seemed to banish all thoughts of worry or doubt. As he wandered, Eric felt his memories begin to fade, the weight of his past slipping away like a distant echo. The political intrigues of the court, the expectations of his father, the burden of his princely duties, all of it seemed to drift into the recesses of his mind, replaced by a simple, contented joy. It wasn't long before Eric encountered the inhabitants of the Forgotten Land. They were a peaceful, contented people, living simple lives in harmony with the land. They welcomed Eric with open arms, offering him food and shelter, though they asked nothing in return. Eric quickly became a part of their community, his days filled with laughter and companionship. He made friends, shared meals, and learned the ways of the land, all the while feeling his old life slip further and further away. Among the people of the Forgotten Land, Eric met a young woman named Lyra. She was kind and gentle, with a quiet happiness that seemed to radiate from her. Eric was drawn to her, and they spent many hours together, talking and laughing as they explored the land. Lyra had no memory of her past, but she seemed content with that. She lived fully in the present, free from the burdens of what had come before. As Eric's memories continued to fade, he found himself growing more and more content in this new life. He no longer thought of the palace, of the crown, or of the responsibilities he had left behind. The peace he had found in the Forgotten Land was all-encompassing, and he began to believe that he had finally found the solace he had sought for so long. But as time passed, Eric began to notice something strange about the people of the Forgotten Land. Though they were always cheerful and content, there was a certain emptiness in their eyes, a lack of depth that Eric found unsettling. It was as if they were living in a perpetual state of bliss, but one that was devoid of true emotion or purpose. Even Lyra, with her constant smile, seemed to lack something, a sense of drive, of ambition, of anything beyond the simple pleasures of each day. This realization began to gnaw at Eric, unsettling the peace he had found. He started to question what he had given up, what he had lost in exchange for this tranquility. The memories he had tried so hard to forget began to resurface, faint but persistent. He remembered the lessons his father had taught him, the sense of duty that had been instilled in him from a young age. He remembered the people of Elandria, the kingdom he was meant to rule, and the responsibilities he had abandoned. One day, while exploring the far reaches of the Forgotten Land, Eric stumbled upon an ancient structure hidden deep within a forest. It was a library, much like the one in the palace, but far older and more mysterious. The building was covered in ivy, and the door creaked loudly as Eric pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the shelves were lined with books that seemed untouched by time. Eric's curiosity got the better of him, and he began to explore the library, pulling books from the shelves and leafing through their pages. The texts were filled with strange, archaic language, but Eric could make out enough to understand their meaning. The library contained the history of the forgotten land, the stories of those who had come before him, seeking refuge from their own pain. As Eric read, he learned the truth about the forgotten land. It had been created centuries ago by a powerful sorcerer, a man who had suffered great loss and wished to create a place where people could escape their pain. The sorcerer had succeeded, crafting a land where all sorrow and memory could be forgotten. But the price was high. Those who entered the land lost not only their pain but also their sense of self, their purpose, and their connection to the world. The more Eric read, the more he realized the true nature of the forgotten land. It was a place of peace, yes, but also of emptiness. The people who lived there had given up everything in exchange for their tranquility, and in doing so, they had lost what made them human. They had become shadows of their former selves, content but without substance, living lives without meaning or direction. Eric was horrified by this revelation. He had come to the forgotten land to escape his pain, but in doing so, he had nearly lost himself. The memories he had tried to forget were what made him who he was, what gave his life meaning. Without them, he was nothing more than an empty shell, no different from the other inhabitants of the land. He knew then that he could not stay. The peace he had found was an illusion, a trap that would strip him of everything that mattered. He had to return to the world, to face the pain and the responsibilities he had left behind. It was the only way to reclaim his identity, his purpose. Eric returned to Lyra, hoping to convince her to leave with him. But when he explained what he had learned, she only smiled and shook her head. She had no desire to leave the forgotten land. She was content here, and the thought of returning to a world filled with pain and sorrow held no appeal for her. Eric realized that she was too far gone, too deeply entrenched in the peace of the land to ever leave. Heartbroken, but resolute, Eric made his decision. He would return alone, if necessary, but he could not stay in the forgotten land any longer. That night, he left the village and made his way back to the archway that marked the boundary of the land. His heart was heavy with the knowledge of what he was giving up, but he knew it was the right choice. As Eric passed through the archway, a flood of memories washed over him. The weight of his responsibilities returned, the pain of his past came rushing back, but along with it came a renewed sense of purpose. He was the crown prince of Elandria, and his kingdom needed him. He could not abandon his people, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. Eric returned to the palace, where the familiar sights and sounds of court life greeted him. The political struggles continued, the weight of his responsibilities was still heavy, but Eric was no longer the disillusioned prince who had fled in search of peace. He had learned that pain and struggle were a part of life, but they were also what gave life meaning. He was ready to face his destiny, to take on the mantle of leadership with courage and determination. The forgotten land remained in his memory, a distant dream of peace that had ultimately revealed itself to be an empty promise. But Eric knew now that true peace could only be found in the world, in the midst of the struggles and challenges that defined him. He was ready to embrace his future, with all its pain and all its joy, for he had discovered that they were both essential parts of what it meant to be alive. The days following Eric's return to the palace were marked by a strange sense of familiarity and alienation. The corridors were the same, the faces he encountered unchanged, but something within Eric had shifted irrevocably. The memory of the forgotten land lingered like a fading dream, its peace tantalizingly out of reach, yet its emptiness stark in his mind. He had returned with the knowledge that no true life could be lived without the full spectrum of human experience, joy, sorrow, struggle, and triumph. The court welcomed him back with a mixture of relief and curiosity. Rumors had circulated during his absence, speculating on his whereabouts. Some whispered that he had been on a secret diplomatic mission, others suggested that he had been sent to a distant monastery to reflect on his duties. But no one, not even his father, dared to question him directly. Eric was grateful for their silence, for he had no intention of sharing the truth of his journey. The Forgotten Land was a secret he intended to keep, a personal revelation that he needed to carry alone. King Alaric summoned Eric to the royal chambers the morning after his return. The king's expression was as stern as ever, but Eric noticed a flicker of concern in his father's eyes. Alaric was a man who rarely showed emotion, but Eric knew that his disappearance had weighed heavily on the old king. "You have returned," Alaric said, his voice gruff. "I trust you have found whatever it was you were seeking." Eric nodded, choosing his words carefully. "I have, father. I understand now what is required of me." The king's eyes narrowed, scrutinizing his son with the same penetrating gaze he used on his advisors and enemies alike. "And what is that?" "To serve this kingdom with all that I am," Eric replied. "To embrace my responsibilities, not as a burden, but as a calling." For a moment, silence hung between them. Then, to Eric's surprise, his father's stern expression softened, and he nodded approvingly. "Good. There is much to be done." With those simple words, Eric was thrust back into the heart of court life. The days became a blur of meetings, decisions, and preparations. The kingdom was facing threats on multiple fronts: rebellious factions in the north, unrest in the eastern provinces, and whispers of war from neighboring lands. Eric threw himself into his duties with a fervor that surprised even himself. He no longer resented the demands placed on him. Instead, he embraced them with a renewed sense of purpose. But as the weeks passed, Eric couldn't help but feel the weight of the crown more acutely. The peace he had experienced in the Forgotten Land was a distant memory, replaced by the relentless pressures of leadership. Yet, he knew that this was where he belonged, that the tranquility of the Forgotten Land was an illusion, a false refuge from the realities of life. One evening, as Eric was poring over maps and reports in his chambers, there was a knock at the door. It was a soft, hesitant sound, unlike the firm raps of the palace staff. Eric called out for the visitor to enter, and to his surprise, Lyra stepped into the room. For a moment, Eric could hardly believe his eyes. Lyra looked much the same as she had in the Forgotten Land, her long hair cascading down her back, her eyes bright and clear, but there was a difference in her bearing. She seemed more grounded, more present in the world around her. "Lyra," Eric breathed, rising to his feet. "How did you—" "I followed you," she interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "After you left, I realized that the peace I thought I wanted was an empty one. I remembered your words, and I knew I couldn't stay in that land forever. So I left, just as you did." Eric felt a rush of emotions: relief, joy, and a profound sense of connection. Lyra had made the same choice he had, rejecting the false peace of the Forgotten Land in favor of a life filled with both pain and purpose. "I'm glad you came," Eric said, taking her hands in his. "There's so much I need to tell you." They spent the next few hours talking, sharing their experiences since leaving the Forgotten Land. Lyra spoke of the journey she had made, the challenges she had faced in adapting to the real world once more. Eric listened, feeling a deep sense of kinship with her. They had both been through something extraordinary, something that had changed them in ways they were still coming to understand. As the night wore on, their conversation turned to the future. Lyra spoke of her desire to find a place in this world, to contribute in some meaningful way. Eric, in turn, shared his vision for the kingdom, the challenges that lay ahead, and the responsibilities he now bore. "Will you stay here, in Elandria?" Eric asked, his voice tentative. Lyra smiled softly. "If you'll have me. I think there's much we can do together, Eric." This kingdom needs people who understand the value of what we've learned, who know that true peace can't be found in avoiding life's difficulties, but in facing them head-on. Eric nodded, his heart swelling with a sense of rightness. Lyra's presence was a gift, a reminder that he was not alone in his journey. Together, they could build something lasting, something that honored the lessons they had learned in the Forgotten Land. In the months that followed, Lyra became an integral part of the court, offering insights and counsel that Eric valued deeply. Her calm demeanor and wise perspective earned her the respect of the courtiers, and she quickly became one of Eric's most trusted advisors. They worked side by side, tackling the challenges facing the kingdom with a united front. The kingdom of Elandria began to change under Eric's leadership. His approach was different from his father's, where King Alaric had ruled with an iron fist. Eric sought to lead with compassion and understanding. He recognized the importance of strength, but he also knew that a kingdom could not thrive on fear and power alone. He began initiatives to improve the lives of the common people, to address the grievances that had fueled the unrest in the provinces. Slowly but surely, the kingdom began to stabilize, and a new sense of hope took root among the people. As the years passed, Eric's reputation as a just and wise ruler grew. The peace he had once sought in the Forgotten Land was now something he was working to create in his own kingdom, a peace built on justice, compassion, and the willingness to face challenges head-on. It was not the perfect, unblemished peace of the Forgotten Land, but it was real, and it was earned through hard work and perseverance. Lyra remained by his side throughout it all, a constant source of support and wisdom. Their bond deepened over time, evolving from friendship into something more profound. They never spoke of the Forgotten Land again, but its memory lingered as a silent understanding between them, a reminder of where they had been, and what they had chosen. In time, Eric ascended to the throne, becoming king of Elandria. His reign was marked by stability and progress, a time of prosperity for the kingdom. He married Lyra, and together they ruled with fairness and compassion, always mindful of the lessons they had learned in the place that had promised peace but delivered emptiness. Years later, when Eric looked back on his life, he knew he had made the right choice. The Forgotten Land had offered him an escape, but it was in the real world, with all its trials and tribulations, that he had found his true self. He had become the leader his people needed, not by running from his responsibilities, but by embracing them. As he sat on the throne, watching the sun set over the kingdom he had worked so hard to build, Eric felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The peace he had sought was not a distant dream, but something he had created with his own hands, in the world he had once tried to leave behind. And in that moment, he knew that this was the true Forgotten Land, a place where pain and sorrow were not erased, but transformed into the foundation of something greater. A place where he had found not just peace, but purpose.